There are missions that never make it into the reports. Missions that exist only in the memories of those who survived them, and in the silence of those who didn't. What happened on the night of October 14th, deep inside a hostile compound on the outskirts of Aleppo, was one of those missions. Officially, it never took place. There are no declassified files, no commendations, no casualty logs. But what was recovered from that night? Damaged bodycam footage, a blood-soaked combat vest, and the last transmission sent through a broken radio tell a story that defies logic, procedure, and survival itself. Staff Sergeant Nathan Cole entered the compound as part of a 6-man team. Within the first 5 minutes, he was shot. Then again, then again. A total of 17 bullets tore through his body. And yet, by the time the Quick Reaction Force breached the compound hours later, they found 5 hostages alive, a hallway littered with bodies, and a single trail of blood that led to a collapsed wall, behind which lay the man who wasn't supposed to make it out. What he did after being shot 17 times should have been impossible. But it happened, and the fact that this story remains buried tells you everything about the lengths they went to keep it hidden. The desert air was dry and electric, the kind of silence that felt engineered, like nature itself was holding its breath. At Forward Operating Base Lucent, the lights were dimmed and every footstep echoed like thunder across the concrete. Inside the mobile command unit, a flickering screen showed the last known drone image of the target compound. An anonymous 2-story structure nestled between crumbling stone buildings in a war-torn district on the outskirts of Aleppo. The area had gone dark on satellite recon 48 hours earlier, and no new ISR feeds had come through since. It was like the whole place had vanished off the map. But the intelligence was clear. 5 hostages, all American aid workers, were alive. For now. Staff Sergeant Nathan Cole stood outside the transport truck with his rifle slung across his chest, the edge of his body armor pressing into the aching scar just above his ribcage. He wasn't new to this. 12 years in the Army, 8 in special operations, over 25 direct action raids across 3 continents. He had seen villages disappear in smoke, comrades bleed out in his arms, and children stand in the aftermath of things they couldn't possibly understand. He had learned the rhythms of war, the smell of diesel and sand, the way fear crept into men's throats just before the drop ramp opened. But this night felt different. Off. The intel package had arrived on a secured line from a back-channel handler. No traceable source, no satellite confirmation, and no green light from higher command. Just a mission. Hand-delivered to his unit's operations officer, marked with one word: priority. The team had trained for this kind of mission. 6 men, Task Force Ember, each with thousands of hours in combat. Cole was second in command, and the most experienced operator on the team. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Barnes, was sharp and by the book, but still wet behind the ears when it came to reading between the lines. Cole had tried to raise concerns about the blacked-out satellite coverage, the odd silence in SIGINT intercepts, the lack of resistance expected in a known enemy hot zone. But there was no room for doubts. The mission clock had already started ticking. As the team loaded up into the vehicle, the internal tension rose beneath the surface. Private Harris adjusted his NVGs for the 4th time. Corporal Mendez silently mouthed a prayer, one hand on the stock of his shotgun. Even McLeod, the team's EOD specialist and resident smartass, didn't make a sound. The only thing breaking the silence was the low rumble of the diesel engine and the soft static of an encrypted comms channel warming up. Cole leaned back in his seat, the Kevlar of his helmet pressing into the steel interior of the truck. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small photograph. A folded, weathered image of his daughter, smiling on a swing set in their backyard in North Carolina. He stared at it for a long moment. There was always a photo. Always something to remember what normal life looked like before the next breach, the next firefight, the next choice that might cost everything. He tucked it back into his vest and gripped his rifle tighter. Outside the wire, the compound loomed in the distance like a shadow against the horizon. There were no guards, no movement, no sentries pacing the roof with cheap rifles like in most IS-held locations. The stillness wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. It meant something was waiting, something that wasn't supposed to be seen, something alive in the silence. The final comms check came through. Static-filled voices confirmed each operator's status. Green lights blinked across the digital map pinned to the operations tablet. It was time. The truck slowed as it neared the drop point, just under 400 meters from the compound. From there, They would move on foot through the ruins of bombed-out homes and empty alleys, skirting the collapsed infrastructure like ghosts. There would be no air support, no drone overwatch, no evac unless the objective was complete. As the rear hatch opened, a wave of heat swept into the truck. Cole stepped into the dust and darkness, his boots crunching softly against broken stone. The rest of the team followed in silence, fanning out into a diamond formation. The stars above offered no comfort, just cold, distant pinpricks in a sky heavy with the weight of things to come. In that moment, every operator knew the risk, but only Cole seemed to feel the warning stitched into the stillness. The way the wind didn't blow. The way even the dogs in the slums had gone silent. He raised a clenched fist, signaling a halt just before the outer wall of the compound. He pressed against it, listening. Nothing. No movement. No voices. Just the kind of quiet that doesn't last long. His breathing slowed as his instincts flared, old training kicking in like muscle memory. He reached for the breaching charge, his eyes locked on the door, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he heard the click of fate slotting into place. They were about to enter a building that wasn't just guarded by enemies. It was waiting for them. The charge ignited with a muted thud, blasting the wooden frame inward as the door splintered in slow motion under the controlled explosion. Dust and fragments billowed through the air as the entry team surged forward, weapons raised, eyes scanning every corner with deadly precision. Cole was third through the breach, heart hammering beneath layers of Kevlar and adrenaline. His boots slammed against the tile floor with practiced urgency as he pivoted left, sweeping his sector. The first room was empty. Abandoned chairs, a broken cot, scattered papers across the ground. No movement. No heat signatures. Just stale air and shadows. The formation held. They moved as one, cutting through the darkened hallways of the compound like a scalpel. Each door was cleared with speed and aggression. Room after room, the silence remained. But it wasn't the calm before the storm. It was something worse. It was engineered, controlled, as if the enemy was letting them walk deeper on purpose. 45 seconds into the breach, the team split into two elements. Cole's half proceeded down the north corridor toward the supposed holding cells, while the others looped around to the south stairwell to gain elevation and coverage. The compound was larger than anticipated. The walls were thick and damp, the ceilings too low for comfort. No power, no generators, not even the usual tangle of wires and makeshift tech that most insurgent safe houses housed. It felt hollow. Wrong. Then came the first sound, barely perceptible, like the scrape of a boot against concrete. It echoed faintly from the far end of the hallway, then vanished. Cole signaled a pause, holding his breath as he strained to hear. Nothing followed. No voices. No footsteps. But the hairs on his arms stood up. A second later, he saw it. A flicker of light, like a reflection bouncing off a rifle scope or helmet visor. Too far to confirm, but unmistakably artificial. Then came the gunfire. The first burst struck without warning. The lead man, Corporal Mendez, was hit in the chest and dropped instantly, his weapon clattering to the ground. Muzzle flashes erupted from both sides of the corridor, slicing through the darkness with precise, overlapping arcs. Suppressed AK rounds ripped into the walls, sending plaster and dust flying in all directions. The team scattered for cover, diving behind debris and door frames as return fire crackled back. Cole's instincts took over. He dropped to his knee behind a broken metal cabinet, returning fire in short, controlled bursts. Two of the enemy went down, but more poured into the corridor from hidden passageways and false walls. They had been waiting. In less than 20 seconds, the ambush had fully unfolded. Enemy positions were fortified behind overturned desks and concrete pillars, elevated on improvised balconies above the main floor. It was a kill box. The team had been herded, not hunted. Cole realized with grim certainty that the intel had been wrong, or worse, intentionally manipulated. These weren't scattered insurgents or opportunistic captors. This was a planned, coordinated defense. A trap. Cole's earpiece filled with static and half-shouted commands. Lieutenant Barnes was calling for fallback, but the southern stairwell was already compromised. Explosives, maybe remote-triggered, collapsed it seconds after the breach. The two elements were now isolated. Cole's group was pinned, outnumbered, and boxed in. The enemy was advancing fast, using overlapping fire lanes to drive them deeper into the compound. As he scanned for escape routes, a round slammed into Cole's upper arm, spinning him partially sideways as pain exploded through his shoulder. His rifle slipped, but he caught it before it hit the ground. Blood soaked through his sleeve almost instantly, sticky and warm. He gritted his teeth and kept firing, leaning against the wall as another burst struck inches from his face, peppering his cheek with concrete fragments. Mendez was dead. Harris was bleeding out behind a flipped table. McLeod was last seen pulling a wounded operator out of the fire zone before vanishing behind a blown-out doorway. Cole crawled across the hallway, dragging himself behind a fallen beam. The world was shrinking. Noise, light, motion, all blending into a single chaotic blur. Every breath came harder than the last. Another bullet tore into his thigh as he rounded the corner, sending him crashing to the floor with a grunt. He couldn't see the shooter, but the sting of hot metal and the dull throb of shattered muscle told him everything he needed to know. He was hit bad. Twice now. Maybe more. Still, he moved. The passage he crawled into was narrow and dark, lined with old crates and rusted pipes. Somewhere to the east, deeper in the compound, he heard the muffled sounds of crying. Female voices. The hostages. Still alive. Still waiting. He had to get to them. But the noise of booted feet followed close behind. Enemy fighters fanning out, clearing the compound room by room, executing anyone left breathing. Cole knew the standard response time. No air support. No evac. The QRF wouldn't come for at least another hour. That meant he was alone. He checked his mag. Half full. The backup pistol strapped to his thigh was intact, though the pain made reaching it agonizing. His comms were dead, possibly damaged by the impact or the debris. He was deafened in one ear, his vision hazy on the edges, and yet, through the haze, through the agony and confusion, there was clarity. The mission had failed. The team was gone or dying, and the hostages were somewhere in this maze of blood and fire. There was no time left for protocol. No time for waiting. Cole took a deep breath and pushed the pain down, crawling forward into the dark with one good arm, blood dripping behind him like breadcrumbs for the dead. The corridor twisted in unnatural ways, a crude architecture shaped by war and secrecy. Cole dragged himself over shattered tiles, one arm pulling, one leg half-functional, his other limbs screaming with every inch. Blood smeared the ground beneath him in thick streaks, already drying along the edges. Dust choked the narrow path, and the only light came from flickering firelight bleeding through a nearby breach in the ceiling. Somewhere above him, distant footsteps echoed. Calculated. Slow. Too deliberate to be friendly. He paused, barely breathing, heart hammering in his throat as he strained to interpret the rhythm. The enemy was sweeping the building, closing in, but they hadn't found him yet. He shifted his weight into the shadow of a broken support beam and checked his wounds. One round had torn clean through the meat of his thigh, another lodged in the soft tissue of his upper arm, and a third had grazed his side, carving a hot, pulsing line across his ribs. There was no time to fully assess the damage, but his breathing remained shallow and his head was starting to spin. Blood loss was catching up to him. He pulled a morphine auto-injector from his vest and jammed it into his thigh. A surge of fire ran up his leg, followed by the numbing cold of synthetic calm. Cole knew the numbers. 17 bullet wounds meant statistically certain death. The only reason he was still conscious was training, adrenaline, and a level of mental conditioning most men never reach. Pain was compartmentalized. Noise was filtered. Mission objectives were hardwired. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the agony and fog, the image of the hostages, bound, scared, forgotten, flickered again like a strobe against the black. He hadn't come this far to bleed out behind a wall. He reached into his belt pouch and unwrapped a field dressing with trembling fingers. The first attempt failed. The second barely succeeded. Cloth pressed into the open wound on his leg, cinched tight with one of the last remaining tourniquets. It wouldn't stop the bleeding entirely, but it might buy him another 10 minutes of mobility. Enough time to reach the central chamber, if he could find it. The compound was a maze, designed to disorient. He could feel the angles shifting, hallways looping into rooms that didn't connect. It wasn't just tactical. It was psychological. Whoever designed it understood how to trap the mind as well as the body. He advanced in increments. Crawl, pause, listen, breathe. Every creak of wood, every groan of concrete overhead amplified the sense of isolation. He checked his comms again. Dead. No signal. No backup. The mission had gone black, and he was now a ghost moving through enemy territory with no tether to the outside world. For the first time since insertion, he truly understood he was alone. His entire team, Men he'd fought beside for years were either dead or dying. The silence on the radio was louder than any gunshot. It was final. Ahead, a flicker of motion caught his eye. He froze, weapon ready, half-conscious fingers tightening on the grip. But it wasn't a fighter. It was a reflection. Light dancing off a piece of glass mounted above a steel door. A surveillance mirror, a relic from when this compound had served as a storage depot, long before it was repurposed by militants. Cole scanned the area for signs of life. Nothing. Just scorched walls and soot-blackened floors. Then, faintly, he heard it again. A muffled cry. Desperate, high-pitched, human. A woman. It was distant, but close enough that it reached past the fog in his brain. He moved toward the sound. Crawling now, dragging himself down a hallway partially collapsed by some earlier blast. Chunks of rebar jutted from the walls like bones, and every surface was slick with grime and ash. He passed a small utility room, empty except for old boxes and a rusted generator, then turned a corner and stopped short. Ahead, the hallway narrowed and curved left, leading toward what looked like an old storage vault. Heavy doors, reinforced frame, and above it, scrawled in white chalk, a crude symbol, likely a signal for insurgent storage or makeshift prison space. He approached slowly, every muscle in his body threatening to seize. His breathing had become shallow, ragged. Vision blurred at the edges, but he forced it clear. His training wouldn't allow failure. Not while there was still someone alive to save. The hallway widened again as he neared the chamber, and that's when he saw the blood. It wasn't his. This was fresher. A smear across the floor, drag marks, a trail leading directly into the vault. He pressed his ear to the cold steel door, listening, muffled sobbing. Then a second voice, lower, speaking harshly in a dialect Cole barely recognized. Guard. Armed, alert. He pulled back, analyzing his options. He had 3 rounds left in his primary. A half-spent pistol with a partial mag. 1 fragmentation grenade. His body was failing, but the plan formed anyway. Clear, brutal, exact. He could breach, just once. It had to be perfect. Then came the sound he dreaded. Footsteps behind him. He turned sharply, vision swimming, and caught a glimpse of movement down the corridor he'd just crawled through. The enemy was closing in. He had minutes, maybe less. He gripped the grenade and prepared to move, but his legs gave out. He slumped forward against the door, body racked with shivers. Darkness crept into the edge of his vision like smoke. He bit the inside of his cheek hard enough to draw blood. The pain brought him back, focused him. He couldn't lose consciousness now. He rolled onto his side, pressing his back to the cold steel. He knew they'd find him soon. Knew that he couldn't run or fight a full squad. But if he could make it inside that vault, if he could neutralize the guard, he could hold out long enough for extraction. Or die buying the hostages one more day. That was the unspoken contract. Not every mission ended in rescue. Some ended in delay, sacrifice, buying time with blood. The footsteps grew louder. He pulled the pin on the grenade and let it rest loose in his hand, the spoon held tight against his palm. His pistol was drawn, trembling, the barrel stained with soot. The weight of 17 bullets lodged in his flesh pulled at every part of him. But still he waited, breath shallow, eyes locked on the door ahead. He was alone, cut off, surrounded, but not finished. Not yet. The world had narrowed to a pinpoint. Every breath Cole took burned like fire in his lungs, each heartbeat a dull thud echoing through a body that no longer responded to will alone. The pain was no longer sharp. It had evolved into something else entirely. Cold, deep, mechanical. He felt it everywhere and nowhere, an omnipresent weight dragging him closer to unconsciousness with every passing second. Blood loss had reached critical. He could feel it in the fading grip of his fingers, in the tremble of his arms, in the black smudges edging into his vision. His hands no longer felt like his own, just extensions of something older, more instinctual. A machine built for this exact moment. 17 wounds. Enough to kill any man. Enough to end this fight long before it truly began. But still, he endured. Behind the heavy vault door, the muffled cries of the hostages came in waves, distorted but unmistakable. Life, innocence, hope, just out of reach. Behind him, enemy boots scraped closer, weapons clutched in readiness, searching for the last ghost in a compound soaked in blood. He knew he couldn't hold both fronts. There would be no cinematic moment of storming out in a blaze of glory. There would be no cavalry, no heroic soundtrack, just steel, breath, and time. His hand hovered over the grenade again, sweat and blood making the metal slick. His other hand still gripped the pistol like a dying prayer. He had choices, but only one path. Fight forward. Always forward. The door in front of him was old but not impenetrable. The hinges were worn, its locking mechanism outdated. A single well-placed explosive could breach it, but the blast would also alert every fighter in the building. It would bring hell. He knew this, accepted it. He reached into his vest and pulled out a final breaching charge, no larger than a thick book, coated in dust and residue from weeks of missions that never made it to the news. With fingers that barely obeyed, he planted the charge low on the seam of the vault door and activated the timer. 10 seconds, enough to roll clear, not enough to escape. The beeping began, slow and steady, the rhythm of inevitability. He crawled backward, dragging his ruined body just far enough to avoid the direct blast. Then the silence shattered. The explosion cracked the hallway open like thunder. Smoke filled the air, debris scattered across the ground, and the vault door groaned before falling inward with a metallic shriek. Inside, he could see shapes, 5 of them, huddled, dazed, eyes wide with terror and disbelief. The hostages, still alive. Still waiting for something that had taken far too long to come. He dragged himself over the threshold, limbs scraping against the jagged frame. The air inside was thicker, hotter. The stench of human fear and sweat hit him like a wave, but the sight of them, real, tangible, pulled him further out of the darkness that had been tightening around his mind. He scanned the room. One guard remained, surprised by the blast, standing in shock near the rear of the chamber. Cole raised his pistol and fired twice. The man dropped. Clean. No hesitation. No second shot required. Just instinct. He reached the nearest hostage, a woman in her 30s with torn clothing and a broken lip, and began cutting through her bindings with a combat knife. His hands shook, but they worked. One by one, he freed them. 5 in total. He signaled them to stay down, to stay quiet. But already the sound of boots on concrete returned, this time rushing, panicked. The enemy knew. They were coming. He looked around. No defensive cover. No fallback route. The room was a dead end, a bottleneck. But it was also a point he could hold. A single man in a narrow space had an advantage, if only for a few minutes. He positioned himself near the doorframe, used what remained of a flipped steel locker as partial cover, and reloaded with shaking hands. Pistol mag in. Rifle slung useless. Shoulder too damaged. Grenade ready, but saved. One last trick for the last breath. As the first shadows appeared at the far end of the hallway, he exhaled slowly, centering himself. The hostages were behind him, clutching each other, praying, crying. He didn't hear them anymore. He didn't hear anything. The moment narrowed, time slowing into fragments. Bootsteps, shouts, muzzle flashes. The storm was coming. He fired. The first man went down, then another. The recoil nearly tore the pistol from his grip, but he steadied. Focused. Every shot had to count. Every round was a life extended, a second earned. They kept coming, but so did he. Body broken, face bloodied, arm nearly useless. But the eyes stayed sharp. Death had knocked, but he hadn't answered yet. Somewhere in the chaos, he felt something change. Not in the battle, but in himself. The pain had become irrelevant. The fear had dissolved. What remained was pure purpose. Every moment had led to this one. The training, the scars, the silence, the loss. It wasn't about heroism. It wasn't about orders. It was about choice. And he had made his. He would die standing. Or he would not die at all. The first wave hit with a fury that cracked the air open like thunder. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness in staccato bursts, gunfire echoing through the stone corridor as enemy fighters stormed toward the vault, unaware, or perhaps simply unbelieving, that a single man stood between them and the prize they had guarded so ruthlessly. Cole held his ground, shoulder braced against the edge of the doorframe, his pistol firing in sharp, controlled bursts. The recoil tore at his already failing muscles, but he forced precision into every movement. The hallway funneled them directly into his line of fire, and for a moment, the narrow space worked in his favor. The first 3 attackers dropped in quick succession, their bodies twisting violently under the force of impact. One bullet caught the lead fighter clean between the eyes. The others took rounds to the chest and collapsed mid-charge. But more followed. Dozens more. Shadows moved in the periphery, flanking positions taken behind crumbled pillars and scattered debris. They advanced with cold intent, a machine of ideology and fury, and Cole could feel their strategy coalescing in the rhythm of their assault. Suppressing fire came from the far end of the hall while a second team moved up the left wall, using flashes and noise to draw his attention. He adjusted his position, biting down on the pain as fresh blood poured from his leg, now barely capable of movement. His arm had gone completely numb, but his fingers still found the trigger. He fired again. 1 round missed. The next 2 did not. Another body fell. The tide slowed but did not stop. Smoke began to thicken in the air. Part gunpowder, part burning insulation from the earlier blast. His lungs seized as he coughed blood, painting red across the inside of his cheek. Still, he kept firing. Time fractured, seconds stretching into hours as the tempo of combat consumed everything else. There were no thoughts anymore, only actions, no fears, only the mechanical rhythm of survival. Somewhere in the blur, his pistol clicked dry. He reached for the last magazine, loaded it with trembling fingers, chambered a round with a grunt that felt like his ribcage was collapsing. The door frame behind which he sheltered shook violently as a grenade went off just beyond it. The blast knocked him sideways, his ears ringing, vision whiting out. For a second he couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. But then, the shape of the hostages re-emerged behind the haze. Huddled in a corner, wide-eyed, silent now with terror beyond screams. That image dragged him back to focus. He rolled onto his side, propped himself up, and opened fire again. This time they hesitated. The attackers had expected collapse. Instead they found resistance. Unyielding. Insane. One of them shouted a command. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. Flank him. End this. Push in hard. Cole knew they were right. He couldn't hold this position for much longer. Blood loss had reached catastrophic levels. His head swam. He blinked to clear his vision, but darkness kept creeping in. A sharp jolt in his side told him a new round had found its mark, below the rib cage, likely liver or kidney. It didn't matter anymore. He forced himself upright and reached for the grenade tucked into the loop on his vest. The last card. He pulled the pin and let the spoon fly, then lobbed it toward the hallway as a cluster of enemies advanced. The explosion was close, the blast wave throwing bodies and debris in every direction. Heat seared his face. Shrapnel shredded the edge of his armor, cutting deep into his forearm. Silence followed. A rare, suffocating silence, broken only by the crackle of fire and the slow drip of blood. He didn't move for a moment. Couldn't. Everything pulsed with pain and exhaustion. But then a groan from the hallway told him what he already suspected. Not all were dead. He leaned against the wall, now slick with soot and blood, and steadied his weapon. More enemies staggered into view. Fewer now, less coordinated, uncertain. They had expected to reclaim this place. Instead, they'd found ruin. Still, they came, driven by orders or desperation or belief. He didn't know, didn't care. He fired again. Missed, fired again, connected. A man spun and fell. Another tried to duck low and was caught mid-step. The last round left his pistol in a metallic click that echoed louder than any explosion. Empty. They paused. He stared back. He could barely lift his arm. The blood loss had numbed everything, even fear. His breath rattled in his chest. One of the attackers raised a weapon, but hesitated. And then, in that moment of suspended violence, the sound came. A distant hum. Low at first. Then louder. A vibration in the floor. The sound of engines. Multiple. Helicopters. The quick reaction force had arrived. The enemy heard it too. Confusion rippled through their ranks. They looked to one another, uncertain, their momentum cracking under the pressure of inevitability. Some ran. Others stayed frozen. Cole didn't move. He couldn't. But his eyes, locked and burning, watched it unfold. Within seconds, gunfire erupted again, but this time it came from outside. Explosive breaches, flashbangs, command voices barking orders in English. Boots thundered through the corridor behind the fleeing enemy. The room filled with new shapes, armored, clean, focused. One of them knelt by Cole, calling his name. He blinked, unsure whether he was alive or dreaming. Then a voice confirmed it. Hostages secured. One operator found. Still breathing. He slumped forward, pistol falling from his hand. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him completely was the American flag patch on the soldier's vest. It shimmered through the smoke like something sacred, something impossible. And then everything went still. The silence that followed was not peace. It was not relief. It was a void. Heavy, profound, impenetrable. In the weeks that followed the rescue, the world moved forward, blind and indifferent, while fragments of the truth were buried beneath classified files, redacted reports, and formal statements devoid of meaning. Staff Sergeant Nathan Cole was medevaced under the cover of night, flown out of the kill zone with his heart stopped twice en route, brought back by hands that would never know the full story of what he endured. His body was broken in places beyond repair, but somehow he survived. No one could explain it. The trauma surgeons, after 12 hours on the table, used the word miraculous in hushed voices, as if the very admission bordered on heresy. 17 wounds, multiple organ failures, permanent nerve damage. Yet the man lived, but survival came at a cost no metal could mend. Cole spent the first 12 days in an induced coma. Tubes filled his lungs, machines breathed for him, and monitors blinked cold rhythms that mapped the edges of death. He awoke in a fog of sterile light, his mind adrift between memory and hallucination. For hours he couldn't separate the hospital ceiling from the cracked plaster of the compound. Couldn't tell if the silence in the room was safety or ambush. His body healed slowly, painfully, but the quiet never left. It followed him, stayed with him. A silence not of absence, but of something that had been torn away and never fully returned. When the officials came, first in clean suits, then in pressed uniforms, they brought no ceremony. There were no parades, no citations, just forms to sign. A recommendation for reassignment, a promise of comprehensive psychological support, and the reminder that what had happened in that compound was not to be discussed. The mission never officially occurred. The names of the hostages would remain sealed for their own protection. His team, those who died, and those who barely made it out, would be folded into vague reports labeled hostile engagement, classified environment. The footage from Cole's bodycam was archived, redacted, and buried in a digital vault few would ever access. His voice logs were scrubbed. His name omitted from the after-action briefings circulated through the higher ranks. A ghost before death. A ghost after. He was given leave, quietly and without honor, returned to American soil like freight. No one met him at the airport. No one told his story. But in a small hospital ward in North Carolina, he sat each day in silence, watching the sunlight move across the floor in thin gold lines. His daughter visited once a week, shy and tentative at first, until the weight of what she didn't understand began to dissolve. She was too young to ask questions about the scars that now mapped his body, or why her father sometimes stared at the wall for hours, unmoving, eyes glassed over. But she hugged him tightly every time she left, and that was something he could still hold on to. The hostages he saved sent letters. They came one by one, each written in careful, emotional prose, handwritten and trembling with gratitude. Some described the nightmares they still endured. Others simply said thank you again and again in looping, shaky lines. None of them ever forgot his name. Some visited briefly, awkwardly, trying not to cry when they saw him in a wheelchair or walking with a cane. He said little. He never spoke about what happened inside those walls. Not to them. Not to anyone. But he listened. Always listened. Years passed. He didn't return to the service. His body couldn't take it. His soul didn't want it. He moved to a quiet cabin on the outskirts of the Smoky Mountains, surrounded by trees and fog. There was no television, no newspapers, just a radio that played old jazz records and the sound of wind in the leaves. He spent his mornings walking the trail behind the property, slow and deliberate steps through the woods. His evenings were for the porch, where he smoked a single cigarette in silence and watched the stars reappear, one by one. No flashbacks, no gunfire. just the echo of things long gone. Every October, on the anniversary of the mission that never existed, he placed 5 stones along the edge of the creek beside his cabin, one for each life he saved. And every year, without fail, 5 visitors came to place wildflowers beside them. No words were exchanged, no names spoken, just nods, a glance, and the understanding that something sacred had happened, something brutal and impossible, and that it had been done by one man who no longer needed the world to know. Cole never spoke again about the compound, the ambush, or the blood. The nightmares came less often, the pain in his joints remained. But he endured. And when people asked, rarely, cautiously, what kept him alive in that hell, he didn't mention training or instinct or orders. He simply said nothing. Because silence had become the language of those who have seen too much and chosen to carry it alone. He had no medals, no recognition, no place in the official records, but the lives he touched, the ones he saved, they knew. He had been shot 17 times, and what he did next could never truly be understood by anyone who hadn't heard the silence that follows war. In the years that followed, the story of Nathan Cole faded from every place it was never meant to be. There were no books written, no interviews aired, no monuments raised in his honor. His name remained absent from military halls and citations, preserved only in the minds of those who had seen what he had done, and even then, spoken of only in reverent whispers, or not at all. The world outside moved on, distracted by new headlines, new wars, new stories to elevate and forget. But in certain circles, off the record, behind locked doors, in whispered recollections among soldiers who had bled in the same dirt, his name was known. Not as a legend, not as a symbol, but as a man who had stepped into hell with open eyes and chose to stay standing when everything in his body told him to fall. His daughter grew older, carrying with her the quiet strength of someone who had once nearly lost everything and somehow gained more than she understood. She never heard the details of what her father endured. He never shared them, but she learned what mattered. That courage was not loud. That sacrifice often leaves no witness. That love is sometimes a man dragging himself forward through fire with nothing left but the will to protect someone he'll never meet. She would go on to study medicine, inspired not by heroism, but by resilience. The silent kind, the one that endures pain without needing a stage. The hostages each lived out their lives differently. Some returned to service. Others never left their hometowns again, but each carried within them a memory forged in blood and smoke. A moment when death seemed certain and salvation came not with fanfare, but with one man bleeding on his knees, pistol in hand, refusing to give up. Every year, they remembered, quietly, together or alone. They never let that memory fade, even when the rest of the world did. And Cole remained until he didn't. Years passed, and time, as it always does, claimed even the strongest flesh. When he died, it was not in combat, nor in a hospital room. It was alone, peacefully, under a sky littered with stars, the woods quiet around him, the porch light casting a soft glow over his weathered frame. In one hand, an unopened letter from his daughter. In the other, the photo he carried through war, worn and faded, corners torn but still whole. His expression was calm, eyes closed, as if listening to something only he could hear. Perhaps he was. Perhaps the silence finally spoke back. There was no official notice, no 21 gun salute, but 5 people came that week, all uninvited, all unknown to each other. They stood at the creek where the stones lay. They placed flowers. They whispered their thanks. And they left. Because that, in the end, was all he had ever asked for. Not glory, not recognition, just the knowledge that what he did mattered. That the blood he gave bought someone else another sunrise. Another chance. Sometimes stories of real heroes are never told. Not because they are forgotten, but because they were never meant for the noise. They were meant for the silence that follows, for the breath between chaos and peace, for the sacred space that lies between what was lost and what was saved. And in that space, Nathan Cole remains. Not as a myth, not as a memory, but as something more. A quiet proof that even when the world looks away, courage still exists, hidden, enduring, alive,